On this week's episode, we decided that punk's not dead, but it really does deserve to die. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Anxietymonkies podcast. I'm your host, Rob, and joining me here in the studio is my co-host, Michelle.
Good morning, everyone. I love our new music.
Yes, we got new theme music, and Joel did a really good job of it. For more information on that, stick around. We'll have some info at the end of the episode. So this week, we're going to kind of take a look at what happened last week. Normally, we have our episodes kind of planned out in advance, so usually by about Wednesday, we know what we're going to record when we head into the studio on Saturday, which was just ducky considering that Wednesday's when the shit really hit the fan. So we made the decision to go ahead with the episode that we'd already planned out. Not just because it would make a nice mental break for everybody trying to cope with what was going on in real time, but also because we'd already put the work in. And honestly, by the end of last week, we still really didn't have a firm grasp on what was going on. But here we are about a week and a half after the incident that occurred in Washington, D.C. I think we're better prepared to actually speak to it. But before we do, we're going to talk about Tuesday, because I feel like the events of Tuesday really got overshadowed by what happened on Wednesday. So for those of you playing along at home, you know that there was a runoff election in Georgia that was going to determine the balance of power in the Senate. Here was an opportunity to make Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell Senate Minority Leader, and it all really came down to whether or not the Democrats won both of the seats that were up for grabs. One of them was a special election between Raphael Warnock and, I forget her first name, her last name's Loeffler. And the other one was a normal Senate race. So the good news is that the Democrats took both those seats, so now Kamala Harris is the deciding vote. I'm not wild about the balance of power being that tight, because it really does mean that you have to get the Democrats to march in lockstep, which is something that they're not really good at doing. Nancy Pelosi's described the Democratic Party as being the big tent party, which means that, you've got people from liberal bastions like California, but you've also got people from states like Missouri where they may call themselves a Democrat, they may subscribe to some of the tenets of the Democratic platform, but in any sane world, in their values and how they vote, they're closer to Republicans. So a lot of these people get painted with a specific brush. They get called blue dog Democrats, which I don't know if that term's still in vogue. I know it was back when Obama was president. But the general idea is that if you want to get anything done as the Democratic Party, you really have to woo them. You have to convince them to get on board. Whereas the Republican Party is much better at getting all of their members to march in lockstep because they've got a tighter focus, basically.
Yeah, they tend to be more of the same thought.
Yeah, they tend to be very unified with less wooing having to be done.
Once again, thank you, Georgia, for not seeing the dark side and staying on the light side. That was really great. I could just imagine Trump just wanting to go on Twitter or Facebook, and unfortunately everybody's blocked him. So if you could just imagine the tirade, he ended up probably turning purple or blue. But going back to what Rob was saying, getting all the Democrats together is sort of like herding cats or ferrets. If you have more than, I would say, 3 or 4, the task becomes daunting. And just like having a ferret that knows how to climb the cage, it changes the game, and you have to start looking everywhere for a ferret that's missing.
Yeah, but speaking of Trump, the other thing that happened last week that I found kind of amazing is we found out on Monday that he had called the Georgia Secretary of State and the governor basically demanding that they find an extra 11,780 votes, enough to, give him a slight win over Joe Biden. And the blatancy of it. I mean, he's saying things like, just tell him that, we reran the numbers and, these are the new results and everything. I mean, it's blatantly obvious what he was asking them to do. He was asking them to find a way to steal the election for him. But, even if he had won Georgia, if somehow they had managed to con the election in his favor, or if they had legitimately found an extra 11,780 votes in their couch cushions or something, getting him Georgia wouldn't have been enough to give him the election.
And the most interesting thing is that, as it's been pointed out on the media, CNN for the win, woohoo! They're not challenging any of the other results except for the presidential.
Oh, yeah.
In which it would make more sense for them to challenge all the results than just the presidential.
Yeah, Trump, the thinking seems to be that, I won in the states that I won, and in the states that I lost, only the presidential vote was what was rigged. Everything else, where Republicans won their seats, that was totally fine. You'd think if the Democrats were going to rig an election, they would have rigged it completely, in the states where they were capable of pulling that sort of thing off. Not only would Biden have won the presidential election, but your senators, your congressmen, they would have won their races as well. So, the thing is I think that was between the events that occurred on Wednesday, because, we're going to talk about the attempted insurrection, sure. But before we talk about that, I want to talk about what happened after the insurrection. Basically they went in, they counted the Electoral College votes, and they certified the election for Joe Biden. I kind of feel like that may have been Trump's last gasp. His attempt to sway the election in Georgia was his last shot, and he's out of gas at this point. There's nothing else he's got, in terms of the courts, in terms of calling up states and threatening secretaries of state and that sort of thing. There's nothing left in there for him to try to sway the election back in his favor. I think that even his staunchest supporters pretty much have to acknowledge that Trump lost. They're going to kick their heels and piss and moan and claim it was stolen from him. But at this point, they're going to have to suck it up. I don't think there's anything they can do about that.
No, the only thing that Trump's got left is a coup.
Yep, and we'll get to that in a second. But, the other thing that I find, I kind of want to talk about Raphael Warnock. Because on the one hand, I've heard a lot of people in the atheist community going, boy, it's kind of weird that we're rooting for a pastor. But at the same time, this is a pastor who preaches at the same church that Dr. King preached at. And if you look at the things that he's calling for, it seems like he's got a lot in common with Dr. Martin Luther King.
Yes.
So as much as I tend to be distrustful of heavily religious people, this is one of those cases where there's an opportunity here to find common ground with the religious and have somebody who's espousing human values and working on the democratic side, rather than being one of these people who claim to be Christian but are pro-death penalty, pro-war, pro-screwing the poor. So all in all, I'm pretty happy with the way things shook out in Georgia. I'm not sure what it portends for the future, but I know it's better than the alternative.
Yeah, definitely better than the alternative.
And on that note, folks, we're going to go ahead and take a quick ad break. Why don't you enjoy the new ad music? Today's episode is brought to you by Pages Printed Plastics. You can visit us at pagesprintedplastics.com. That's P-A-I-G-E-S printedplastics.com. We have a couple of different printers. We can do design as well as print. We can print anything from small figures like D&D miniatures to larger objects like computer parts, toys, props, pretty much anything you can imagine. So feel free to check us out. Again, that's pagesprintedplastics.com. And we're back. So I guess the next thing we're going to talk about is what happened on Wednesday in Washington, D.C. Some people are calling it a riot. Some people are calling it an insurrection. I'm kind of going with the million more on March, but I don't feel like that really hits the nail on the head. It wasn't a march. These assholes broke into the Capitol building, destroyed a bunch of stuff, looted offices, tracked feces everywhere. Committed murder. Yeah, there's a death toll associated with this. More cops were killed at this thing than, the zero death toll of police officers at the protests in Portland and Minneapolis and everything else.
And some people are comparing this to the Black Lives Matter, and oh my God, how can you even compare?
Right. Not to mention, this is Schrodinger's protest, because on the one hand, you've got people taking selfies and talking about, doing this in the name of God Emperor Trump. And, you've got identified members of the QAnon movement. But, once the consequences started to surface and once people started to see what was really going on, suddenly, no, these people don't represent the president. They're secret Antifa.
People, please, you don't know what you're talking about.
Oh, no. I don't think this is a matter of people not knowing what they're talking about. I think this is them deliberately trying to shift the blame. Oh, this wasn't us. This was the other guys. This was the people we warned you about, which is bullshit, because, you're not likely to see, Antifa or Black Lives Matter fighting to keep Donald Trump in office. These people were talking about, hanging Mike Pence and overturning the vote and all this other garbage. Yeah, this isn't the work of Antifa or Black Lives Matter. This firmly lands on the head of Donald Trump.
Yeah, this was definitely Trump pushing people and pushing buttons and
calling for an insurrection.
And all parties involved were like, oh, he said so let's do it.
Yeah, I thought it was hilarious. The other night, they had the attorney on for the QAnon shaman. That was the doofus running around with the buffalo horns and the awful tattoo work. And basically his claim is that the president should pardon him and that he's not guilty of any crimes because he was there at the president's invitation. If he's there at the president's invitation and he didn't commit a crime, then what does he need a pardon for?
Exactly.
The other thing I'm kind of seeing with this, in my day job, some of what I do has to do with securing sensitive facilities. And there's a model that they use. It's called the Swiss cheese model. And the idea is that you have security in layers so that if something gets through one hole, it's stopped by the next layer of security. So you've got security in depth, and, it may not be perfect at every step of the way, but with all those layers, it prevents bad actors from getting into these facilities and doing real damage. What we saw here in D.C. was kind of a perfect storm of where that falls apart, because it looked to me like none of the security they had was deep enough, not enough layers, and none of those layers were strong enough to stop these people from getting in. So definite security failures. And I think that the failure really comes down to an assumption that law enforcement had fallen for. Oh, these guys support us, these guys back us. But once they stopped getting their way, they turned on the cops just like they would on anybody else. And it really came down to the Secret Service inside the Capitol building being responsible for protecting everybody there and stopping the incident. One of the things that we're seeing in the aftermath, one of the things that's coming to light is how many former military personnel and how many law enforcement personnel were actually part of this insurrection. Not to mention those officers who let the protesters in, who posed for selfies with them. It's no wonder that things got as bad as they did. The other thing too is that, with them assuming, oh, these protesters are on our side and wouldn't turn on us, the response that they had in place wasn't strong enough. You look at the troops that they had, when Black Lives Matter protesters showed up in Washington, D.C., those guys, came in numbers, they came armed, they came ready to kick ass and take names. This time around, you had a handful of D.C. cops, not really armed for the task, not really expecting any real pushback. And this is what happens when you don't take things like that seriously. But I think what we're going to see is a real response that starts in the wake of this incident. Right now they have something like 300 federal cases that they're pursuing against these protesters. A bunch of them have been arrested and are, waiting for charges to be filed against them, or, waiting for their court dates. And this kind of gets to something else, that these protesters, they didn't come ready for the consequences of their actions. You look at the protests in Minneapolis or Portland, which I keep citing because they're the most prominent examples of major protests that we've had recently, and you've got people showing up in black bloc ready to engage the police, ready to push back against them, and ready to avoid being detected in the aftermath of their actions. Contrast this with the cosplayers who showed up for a giant LARP at the Capitol building. They showed up in costume, they took selfies, they left their phones on, they posted pictures with the EXIF data intact onto places like Parler and Facebook and YouTube and whatnot. So the feds are going to have a pretty easy time tracking these jackwads down and subjecting them, hopefully, to some real justice.
And not to mention, I think it's the DA or the assistant...
The Attorney General?
The Attorney General, I think, is looking at possible charges for Giuliani, Donald Trump Jr., and the representative that was there.
Mo Brooks from Alabama.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, this is one of those cases where it's not just going to be the petty actors in the field facing charges. It's going to be some of the instigators, some of the people who made the call for insurrection, possibly facing charges as well. And frankly, I hope they do. I don't think that much will come of it, but there's a hope.
And I certainly hope that somebody goes after Don as well.
Yeah, I don't know if, in the legal world, there's this idea of precedence, the idea of we're charging him and we're going to hold the trial in this way and here's what he's looking at because this is what's come before. A lot of what Trump did, there's no precedent for, at least in terms of a sitting president. There's a lot of stuff that the president gets away with because he has, presidential immunity from prosecution. But to call for an insurrection while he's the president, nobody else has ever done that. So I don't know how that's going to shake out. I think there's going to be a lot of people who aren't going to want to file the charges, who aren't going to want to put the work in because they feel like they're not the ones who should be doing it. And there's a real argument to be made for letting Joe Biden's Attorney General, I think he's picking Merrick Garland for that role, letting him do the work behind it to file these charges. And the thing that worries me is that when Obama became president, one of the first things he started talking about was that he wasn't going to file charges against George W. Bush for, anything having to do with Iraq or anything having to do with Dick Cheney's secret no-bid contracts and meetings with energy executives for the sake of national unity and healing the nation and all that jazz. And in the aftermath of what happened in D.C., we're seeing a lot of Republican politicians talking about needing healing for the nation and needing unity. And frankly, I'm not feeling that forgiving. I'm not feeling like we should be finding unity with out-and-out Nazis or fascists or, people willing to subvert our democracy for their party. So, I'm hoping that Joe Biden reads the room, if you will, and decides to actually file charges against these bellends instead of letting them get away with what they did.
And not to mention that, if Joe Biden doesn't, then it's possible for some of the people's family that died to press civil charges as well.
Sure, but a lawsuit, assuming you can even collect, because, for all of his talk of being a billionaire, I don't know that Trump actually has much in the way of money. He's got some land holdings, but would those assets be seized and the proceeds used to try to give the families of the people who lost their lives in this insurrection some sort of justice? Or would it be seized and the assets being sold to go pay off his creditors first? I'm not sure how that would work. And frankly, if I was somebody who lost a family member in this insurrection, money wouldn't be enough to make up for that loss. I would want to see him and his lackeys do some hard time behind this.
I mean, comparatively speaking, with what happened to OJ, the Goldmans ended up taking him to court, as history shows.
Yeah, they won the civil suit, and Ron Goldman's hobby has basically been going after OJ and seizing every nickel he gets. So I could see people doing that in the wake of. But again, I don't think that that's real justice. I think, I would want to see them do prison time. I'd want to see them face the consequences of their actions in a way that's more than them being broke.
Well, yeah, obviously you would want them to be behind bars, but if you can't do that,
You take what you
you
can
take
get.
what you can get, and that's going to hurt Donald.
Yeah, I think so. I think in a way that would be a blow to his ego, having to acknowledge that he's broke, having to admit that he can't pay off a lawsuit because he doesn't have the money. The other consequence that came in the wake of this is that Twitter finally banned Donald Trump, Facebook finally banned Donald Trump. But, this comes back to what I was talking about a couple of episodes ago when we were talking about incels and anti-vaxxers, that this was too little too late, that this was a marketing decision on the part of Facebook and Twitter because, they like the ad revenue that they generate off of having somebody with, 5.5 million followers or whatever it was when they banned him. But, they finally reached a point where this was going to start costing them money, start costing them, potential ad revenue as people started pulling away from them. If you're going to support somebody like Trump, we're not going to advertise with you. So again, totally a marketing decision that had nothing to do with ethics or morals or banning him because it's the right thing to do. So, he is facing the consequences of his actions, but I would argue that these consequences don't go nearly far enough. And on that note, we're going to take another ad break, folks. This week's episode is brought to you by us. We enjoy bringing this podcast to you at no cost to you, but there are costs associated with running the podcast. We've purchased a new microphone for the studio, and we're in the process of purchasing new theme music to use for the episodes themselves. So if you want to help us out with that, there's a couple of ways you can do that. One is to tell all your friends. The more listeners we have, the more ad revenue we generate. But I'd like to get away from generating ad revenue, and the way you can help us out with that is by signing up and sponsoring us on Patreon. We can be found at patreon.com/anxietymonkies, and for as little as $1 a month, you can get bonus features such as being thanked live on air, or for $3 a month, you get ad-free episodes, and at $5 a month, we give you extra bonus Patreon content. So again, that's patreon.com/anxietymonkies if you want to help us out. We'd greatly appreciate it. And now, back to the show. Ooh, we're back again. And our closing item comes from the What the Living Fuck department. So in the wake of the Wednesday insurrection in the Capitol, the dead Kennedys put out a tweet that has left me just, speechless damn near. The tweet was, "Thank you, Mitt Romney and Evan Mullen. You guys actually care about the USA," or something like that. They followed this with another tweet claiming that Lindsey Graham is trying to do the right thing.
Now, let me say, for all of you out there, Jell-O does not share these.
Yeah, we'll get to that in just a second. It's just, okay, so a little bit of background is in order here. The Dead Kennedys were founded in 1978 by Jello Biafra and East Bay Ray. They got together with, another couple of members and started doing punk music in the San Francisco area. Again, 1978, they, in the time that they were together, they put out 4 albums and an EP. Some of their hits include Holiday in Cambodia, Too Drunk to Fuck, Nazi Punks Fuck Off, Police Van, Soup is Good Food. There's a bunch of great songs that they did. And I got turned on to them when I was 17, long after they had broken up. Now, that happened in 1986. They broke up after an obscenity trial for their Frankenchrist album, which included Landscape Number 20 by Swiss surrealist artist H.R. Giger. Jello talks about this in one of his spoken word albums, and he does a far better job of telling the tale than I ever could. So I think it was his I Blow Minds for a Living album where he talks about that. So I'd refer you to that if you want the full story. But the long and short of it is, so they were together from 1978 to 1986. Levi's offered to use Holiday in Cambodia in a commercial. Jello wouldn't sign off on it. And the rumor is that this was the reason that his former bandmates decided to sue him. They would say that it was over the contracts that they signed, back when they were together and how the royalties were paid out. And honestly, I'm not really well versed in the details. I could go read it again and try to respout it here, but the long and short of it is that they sued Jello Biafra. They got some of the rights to the music and things like that. And in 2001, they got back together without Jello. Since then, they've gone through more lead singers than the United States has rolls of toilet paper in the pandemic. But the thing to note, a lot of the songs that they did on their early albums, the credit goes to East Bay Ray and Jello Biafra. And I have a sneaking suspicion that East Bay Ray getting credit for those songs was more of a formality than it was any actual artistic talent on his part, because ever since they got together back in 2001, they put out a bunch of albums, but all of these albums are live shows where all they're doing is performing songs that they performed back in the day. So the Dead Kennedys has basically become a Dead Kennedys tribute band. These guys went from singing Chicken Shit Conformist to being a bunch of chicken shit conformists singing Chicken Shit Conformist. So in the aftermath of the tweet, 2 tweets actually, the band claims it wasn't them, that it wasn't East Bay Ray, that it was their social media manager. So they kind of hung him out to dry. It's just, I would be livid if something that I had put so much of my time and energy and effort into was then subverted to support things like Mitt fucking Romney and Lindsey fucking Graham.
Yeah, this just, it goes against what the band originally stood for.
Yeah. Well, and it doesn't help. Like, they make the claim that they're not a political band, but there's a couple of views on that. I mean, one way to look at it would be that everything's political. Your banker knows this, your landlord knows this, your boss knows this. There's nothing out there that isn't political in some way or another. The other way to look at it is that punk is an inherently political music genre. And I'm not gonna go into that argument here, except to say that I tend to agree with that view of it, and that a lot of the punk that I like tends to be very political in nature. It was a working class movement started in England, and I think there's a lot of, like, punk has done a lot to raise political awareness among the working class. And I think that we forget that legacy at our own peril. Well, folks, I think that's going to do it for us this week. Thank you again for joining us. You can find us on most of the major podcast markets. And if you'd like to review us and give us 5 stars, that'll help others find us. We're on Twitter at Anxietymonkies, Facebook at facebook.com/anxietymonkeys, and you can email us at anxietymonkeys@gmail.com. You can watch me get my ass kicked at vintage video games on twitch.tv/anxietymonkeys. This week I'll be playing the rest of Adventure Island and possibly Adventure Island 3. Our episode music was composed by Joel Gerhardsen and is used with permission. You can find him on Instagram at dream.emu.lator. And finally, if you've got a couple of bucks you want to kick our way, you can do that at patreon.com/anxietymonkeys, or go in for a one-time donation at paypal.me/anxietymonkeys. Until next week, she's Michelle, I'm Rob, and we're your Anxiety Monkeys.